I read a book called Iron John by Robert Bly. I was probably in my 20s. Iron John is based on a Grimm story, and it's a book about men. In the story, Iron John lives at the bottom of a pond. After he gets out of the pond, he's put in a cage by the king. A young boy loses his golden ball after it rolls into the cage with hairy Iron John. The only way the boy can get his golden ball back is by freeing him from his cage. And to free him, he has to get the key from under his mother's pillow. I'm not completely sure about this story because I've never dreamt of the hairy man at the bottom of the pond. But I can get it if it's about boyhood. If it's about that period of time, at adolescence, somewhere between childhood and manhood. I guess if I see the story from the point of view of the boy whose golden ball has rolled into the cage, I can get this story. And Iron John is a book about male psychology, in a way. There seems to be something about the boy finding more of his masculine identity by getting that ball back out of the cage. In the story, the young boy has to get the ball back. And to do that, he has to free the wild man, Iron John. And to do that, he has to steal the key from under his mother's pillow. Freud might like this story because he had a lot to say about boys and their mothers. He reminded us of the Oedipus complex, or the mother problem, and the primary entanglement with the mother. And not only in Freud, but in Jung too. We get this idea of the mother as the first and the powerful carrier of the feminine. She's our first world, said Jung. She is the first love of our life, he said. We love our mother, and psychologically speaking, that might be the point, because we can't stay in the lap of childhood forever. The mother rules over family and childhood, we could say. The mother complex could be wanting to stay in the lap of the mother for too long, wanting to stay in the charmed circle of childhood, to use Jung's language. And somewhere in puberty, there's this further cutting, there's this stage which is like a further cutting of the umbilical cord, psychologically speaking. To put it in the language of the story, we might need to steal that key from under the mother's pillow to find more of our place in the world. Anyway, I was close to my mother, and I know there's an awkward time for any boy somewhere in boyhood, when you realize how much you love your mother, but then you might also have to break away to find more of yourself. I'm just following the story for a while, and in this story, the young boy has to get his golden ball back, and he has to free Iron John. And to do that, he has to steal the key from his mother's pillow. Robert Bly said some funny things in his book when he was talking about telling this story, and some of the younger men saying something like, do we have to steal it? We couldn't possibly steal that key. It was just humorous at the time. But, the point of the story is like that theft of you have to take it. You have to take that key. And in the story about Aboriginal initiation that I read, once a boy reached a certain age, his mother would stop talking to him. Not only that, all the women in the kind of tribe would kind of give them the cold shoulder and stop talking to the boys. They were kicked out of the mother's realm, so to speak. and they had to go out and hang out with the men for a while to do the men's business. And it was very clearly, in those traditional cultures, there really was that kind of delineation between the women's business and the men's business, so the boys had to go out and hang out with the men to do some of the men's business. They had to leave their mother's realm and enter into the father's realm. And it was through the men that the boys were initiated into the first stories of the tribe. That's the traditional rite of passage. And through traditional rites, there is some kind of separation that takes place from the mother. The boys are initiated into a more adult world and more of their masculine identity. There were intricate rites of passage, said Jung, in so-called primitive societies, because the mother is the first bearer of the soul image. Separation from her is a delicate and important matter of the greatest educational significance. He goes on to say, accordingly, amongst so-called primitives, we find a large number of rites designed to organise this separation. The mere fact of becoming an adult and of outward separation is not enough. Impressive initiations into the man's house and ceremonies of rebirth are still needed in order to make the separation from the mother and hence from childhood entirely effective. Of course, we don't have these formal, traditional initiation rites anymore, but maybe we can still get some insight into a psychological process that takes place. According to Jung, separation from the mother might not always be entirely effective. There might be some mothers that don't really want their sons to get those keys or to get the key from under the pillow. They'd like for the childhood to continue. And there might be some sons that don't really want to steal the key because they would also like the charmed circle of childhood to continue. Jung said it can be like a conspiracy between the mother and the son to stay in childhood. They might both want for the situation of childhood to continue. And I think, when we're talking about, this doesn't mean, these traditional rites are like a separation, initiation, return. It doesn't mean that one doesn't love one's mother, but the separation, the initiation, are part of the process. So that, ultimately, I suppose, there's this idea of, in the return, there's somehow a more mature love. Robert Bly wasn't that fond of the mother-bound son, which he often associated with the New Age boys. They are nice and polite and sensitive and all of that, he seemed to be saying. We like them. They have good manners, but they might not have stolen the key from under their mother's pillow yet. They might not have found the natural man who is still locked up or caged in the psyche, just like Iron John. They still haven't made the initiation into manhood or into adulthood. Robert Bly was very influenced by Marie-Louise von Franz, and neither of them really liked the mama's boy that much. And the story of Iron John was like a story of male initiation for Robert Bly. But I've always liked something that James Hillman said. And, I think if you go back to Jung, he sometimes speaks about the first half of life and the second half of life. And I'm not saying it always works exactly like this, or that there's an exact formula, or, you know, one can be too categorical or anything like that. But I think that, you know, if you think of puberty rights in the first half of life, and that separation to take one's place in the world, that might be kind of necessary. But James Hillman said that in the second half of life, if we follow Jung, the initiation for men can be more likely through the feminine not like the mother. It might even be the way of individuation, as Jung has called it. So it's kind of like the first half of life is through the masculine, through the male initiation for men, and then in the second half of life through the feminine. The initiation for boys was about being initiated more into their masculine identity. But in the second half of life, there's a different kind of initiation that might need to take place, more through the feminine. Let's say someone's grounded in their masculine identity, but in the second half of life, someone might be faced, a man might be faced with more of a one-sidedness in their masculinity. That might become a problem. And if that happens, everything can start to dry up or become barren or sterile, and if not destructive. You know, once Jung said one-sidedness is, a neurosis is one-sidedness. So if masculinity becomes one-sided, that can be a problem. And that kind of one-sided development might eventually lead to a road of ashes, dissent, and grief, as Robert Bly calls it, which is a further part of that story of I and John. In some ways, the second half of life is not so much the heroic myth or something like that. It's not St. George conquering the dragon. It's more like Sir Gawain looking for a cup or a chalice. A man is asked to love his own soul, as Hillman said. And the soul always loves depth, again, as Hillman said, quoting from Heraclitus. Renewal might come more through the feminine. To put it in another way, somewhere in the midlife, a man might be confronted by aspects of his inner life. He might be forced into more of a deepening. It might include more of his deep feeling life, the other side of himself. You know, I'm not saying, again, that this is formulaic, absolutely set, but often, you know, it's that other side of ourselves in the midlife that we're confronted with. This is not quite what we learned in the school of masculine heroics, where they didn't like touchy-feely subjects all that much, or any undue Latino emotional expressiveness, and where the main thing was never to show any weakness, and where sometimes the inner life and the feeling life, culturally speaking, was seen as inferior or as messy and chaotic. And sometimes for men, you know, that messy or chaotic inner life could be more scary than killing a wild bull. And it goes against some of the most basic training of the heroic model. A man might have to turn inwards towards the anima in Jung's language. That might happen either willingly or unwillingly, whether he likes it or not. He might get dragged, kicking and screaming, into that side of himself. And the anima is like an archetype of relationship, an archetype of life, as Jung called it. And it might include some kind of dissent, and more of an intimacy with that other side of himself, which can ultimately be a source of renewal. He might have to take some of that body armor off, put down the sword, drop some of the masculine superiority or some of the ego strength or the power of the will or some of the masculine defenses, because what is really needed is more of an openness, a receptivity, an intimacy, a relationship, an interiority, and a depth maybe. He needs an intimacy more with his own soul. Even Hercules had to serve the Lydian queen and spin and weave his female soul, said Hillman. And the renewal can come through these movements downwards into the soul, which is what we might call individuation through the feminine. According to Hillman, there are two figures from myth who are in good relationship with the feminine, and both of them are non-heroic in the traditional sense. And they are Dionysus and Odysseus. Dionysus, because of his natural affinity with the feminine, he was known as a god of women, enjoyed the company of women, and was at home in their world. With Dionysus, he had always had the feminine as a structure of consciousness, says Hillman. And Odysseus, because he was surrounded by feminine figures that play many roles, as Hillman says. The goddess Athena, mistress Calypso, devourer Scylla and Charybdis, enchantress Circe, mother, daughter Arete Nausicaa, personal mother Anticlypsia. I'm not quite sure how you say that. Rescuer Enos, seductress the sirens, wife Penelope. There are so many female figures in the Odyssey. The feminine is there in all of its many forms, and the feminine is guiding Odysseus towards Ithaca.